Hello, writers. Today we're talking about how to start your book and how not to start your book. The beginning of a novel is absolutely crucial because that is where readers decide whether they're going to keep on reading, and that is where agents decide whether they're going to represent you or not, and that's where publishers decide whether they're interested in publishing your book. And if they're not going to keep on reading. Gone are the days where people say, "Oh yeah, just keep reading. It gets better." Nobody does that anymore. People have a short attention span, and if you don't snag them from the get-go, you're going to lose them. So I'm going to talk today about the great ways to start your book and the ways that you absolutely should not begin any novel anytime. I'm Karena Akhavein. I am a PhD writing coach whose mission in life is to take people like you from aspiring writer to successful author. And I do that with some bite-sized, actionable chunks of information that help you out and then get you right back to writing. Okay, let's get started. First of all, how not to start your book. The first thing that you should not do when you're starting your book, do not start with a prologue. Prologues used to be kind of this little trendy fashion thing, I think. Probably back in the 1800s, 1900s, people loved their prologues. And now agents and editors tend to consider the prologue to be lazy writing. So whatever you wanted to stick in the prologue, you're going to need to find a better way to incorporate it into your book. These days, people like to have a book start in the thick of the action or in the thick of the conflict so that you really get just grabbed and moving right along into the story right away. You don't want to have all this back stuff, this backstory. And in fact, that is another way not to start your book, is with an overload of front-loaded backstory. Sound confusing? I know, it is. Basically, the backstory is all of those little details that you eventually want your reader to find out. But guess what, guys? They don't need to know all of that first thing. You can incorporate the backstory more naturally through dialogue or through flashbacks or through the action, and you can reveal these things little by little. It's a much more compelling way to kind of tell the backstory that feeds into your novel. It used to be that you would start a story with once upon a time. You just don't do that anymore, you guys. Here is the third way not to start your novel. And this is a huge pet peeve of so many people, including readers, agents, publishers, all of that. This might have worked back in the day, like maybe when you were Kafka, it might have worked. Let me tell you what it is. It's starting your book with a dream or with waking up from a dream or waking up confused. So if you're Kafka and you're writing about some dude waking up as a cockroach, that was really unique back then. Now it's been done to death, and people do not like getting fooled or being told about this whole world that ends up not being true. And also, starting with your character waking up, brushing their teeth, having a meal, and going about their day is not compelling. You need to start with something that's different in their day, not with routine. So that's a little hint as to something that you would want to start with. Start with where their normal established routine of life goes south, where it changes, where something interrupts that normal life that they were having. That's where you want to start your book. Here's another thing that you don't want to start with. I always talk about dialogue, and dialogue is really, really awesome. And we like to use dialogue to break up a book, but you don't want to start your book with too much front-loaded dialogue either, because dialogue is fascinating when you know the characters and it's giving you more insight into what makes your characters tick. And if you don't know your characters already, you don't really care about the characters or know how they work, you're not going to be as invested in the dialogue, and it's just going to be a little bit confusing. So I think that you want to start your book not with dialogue, not with expository writing, but probably with some kind of action or some kind of conflict. There can be a little bit of dialogue, but you really need to work out the balance of this so that your book starts off with a bang. Sometimes literally, some books do start off with something that's just an explosive event. And that actually is a pretty good way to start a book. And I get it. Not all books are these action thrillers that have explosions and gunfire and all this stuff. But what emotionally is the equivalent of a bomb or an explosion or gunfire in your character's life? That's what you're going to start with. Here's another thing that you do not want to start your book with, and that is with the death of a main character. No, you don't want to, you're psycho. You don't want to kill off this main character right away. You want to make us love them before you murder them. I'm just kidding a little bit. You need to start the story unless, okay, here's the one exception. If your story is kind of a Agatha Christie type or a police procedural or a murder mystery, yes, sometimes formulaically you start with a murder or you start with the death of the murderee who's kind of not a main character. Or maybe it is, but you kind of have to tell the story in flashbacks and it has to make sense. This is kind of a hard way to structure your story, but if you are able to do that, good for you. Otherwise, don't kill anybody else in the first minute. Let's get to know your characters. Let's see what the stakes are before we off them. I mentioned getting to know your characters. Definitely at the beginning of your book, we want to start to get to know your main characters. So your protagonist and your antagonist. This is what it's for. We don't want to be getting to know the peripheral characters that much. They're not as important to us. So let's really get an insight into what makes your main character tick right from the get-go. By knowing what makes them tick, we know what the stakes are, we know what drives them, we know what their motivation is, and we're going to kind of see what's going to start to push the action of your story. The last thing that you don't want to start your book with too much of is description. So if you have too much description front loaded into your first chapter, that can be all poetic and lovely, but it really needs to have a reason for being. So I'm thinking about a few books that I've read in the past where there is some description of a setting, but usually that's an opportunity to show how that setting has been changed by what's about to happen. So, for example, don't just describe a pretty forest unless you're going to explain what's different today about the forest that's going to launch the action of your book. So, for example, your character is going to stumble upon a tree that's been cut, or a corpse in the forest, or they're going to find a symbol carved into a tree, something like that. But you really don't want to be describing too much that doesn't have a reason to be described right now. Description can really help with your pacing in other parts of your book where you want to slow things down and you want to kind of make the reader have to be patient to get some information that they're really wanting. However, the very beginning of your book is not a place to do that. You guys, I hope this helped. I hope you see how the beginning of your book needs to be high impact, whether it is in the action or in the emotions. It needs to be something that brings you an understanding of your main character and of what drives them, what the stakes are, what's important in their world. And it needs to be something that is compelling to your reader, to your editor, to your agent, and to your publisher. That is it, you guys. I hope that this helped you. It's a very brief video and I think it's chock full of information. So let me know down below if you have any questions or comments, or if I skipped over anything that you think is crucial. I would love to hear from you. I will see you guys very soon with another video full of information, inspiration, and motivation. But in the meantime, keep on writing.